the story of Mrs. Rosa, her daughter Lucia, and her grandchildren. In this unique video, you'll explore how living near your children in later years might impact your happiness and well-being more than you realize. Rethinking your living arrangements could significantly enhance your quality of life. Prepare to be intrigued by a surprising new insight. But first, pay close attention to this story, as it reveals an essential lesson for you. Mrs. Rosa, a 70-year-old widow, chose to move in with her daughter Lucia after her husband's passing. The thought of being near her grandchildren and lending a hand around the house filled her with joy. After all, who wouldn't want to be surrounded by loved ones as they age? The idea of sharing family life felt like a dream fulfilled. Mrs. Rosa felt as though she had won the lottery. Their days, the family honeymoon, when everything feels just right. The days were filled with children's laughter, delightful aromas from the kitchen, and a comforting sense of purpose. This is life, she thought as she prepared breakfast for her grandchildren. Her daughter Lucia's home had become a paradise of multi-generational togetherness. Mornings passed with French toast and invented tales, while afternoons saw Rosa assisting the little ones with their homework, bringing back memories of her days as a teacher. "Grandma, can you help me with math?" little Mateo asked, melting her heart. A recent Stanford University study indicated that intergenerational living can enhance happiness and a sense of purpose in grandparents, and Rosa was living proof of it. She felt more alive than ever, as though she discovered the fountain of youth in her grandchildren's smiles. But you know what they say? When things seem perfect, they sometimes aren't. And this is where Rosa's story takes an unexpected turn. One afternoon, while preparing dinner, Rosa overheard Lucia on the phone. "Mom is a blessing. I don't know what we'd do without her." Rosa felt a swell of pride, along with a faint hint of something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps a touch of concern. The philosopher Epicurus once said, "It's not that we have too little time, but that we waste much of it." Rosa was beginning to feel as if every minute of her day was occupied. Where were those quiet moments for reading a favorite book or simply gazing out the window? Days blurred into weeks, then months. A routine settled in. Breakfast, homework, lunch, more homework, dinner. Rosa found herself reminiscing about her old apartment and the freedom to decide how to spend her time. She chided herself, "How can I feel so ungrateful when I have everything I ever wanted?" One Sunday morning, while making Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes, because honestly, what grandmother hasn't? Rosa realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd slept in or gone out with friends without worrying about being back in time for dinner. Psychologist Erik Erikson spoke of the importance of preserving autonomy in older age. But Rosa felt her independence slipping away in a blend of family love and unspoken responsibilities. One evening, after tucking in the children, Rosa sat on the porch, gazing up at the stars. She asked herself, "Is this really what I want for the rest of my life?" The question lingered, unanswered, like a balloon adrift in the night sky. Poet Robert Frost once wrote, "Two roads diverge, the quiet transformation, from cherished grandmother to unpaid caregiver." What began as occasional visits to help with her grandchildren soon became a full-time commitment. She now found herself changing diapers, preparing bottles, and chasing after little bundles of energy. Sound familiar? You're not alone. Epicurus once said, "Time doesn't stand still, and neither does life." Mrs. Rosa was beginning to feel the full weight of these words. Her days, once filled with social outings and personal time, were now completely occupied with the needs of her children and grandchildren. Yet, here's the interesting part. Mrs. Rosa never complained. Like many grandmothers, she felt a sense of duty to support her family. However, the fatigue began to build up, accompanied by an inexplicable feeling of loss. This is where the term grandmother syndrome comes into play. No, it's not the title of a new Netflix series, though it could be. This phrase, introduced by Dr. Antonio Guaro, describes the emotional and physical toll grandmothers face when they take on unpaid caregiving roles. Imagine being on an emotional roller coaster. On one side, you deeply love your grandchildren and treasure each moment with them. On the other, you feel as though life is slipping away as you change another diaper. It's like trying to embrace a cactus, beautiful yet painful. Studies show that this syndrome can have serious effects on grandmothers' mental well-being. The lack of appreciation, physical strain, and loss of freedom can lead to depression and anxiety. It's as though you're running the cost of living together when love turns into a weight. Mrs. Rosa's story takes a surprising turn. What started as a vision of family unity shifts into a quiet struggle. Ever wondered how a decision made with the best intentions can lead us down a path we never anticipated? Mrs. Rosa's daughter, Lucia, begins to reveal her true nature. One day, while Mrs. Rosa is preparing lunch, Lucia walks into the kitchen with a scowl. "Mom, how many times have I told you that the kids don't like onions? Why do you insist on adding them to everything?" The criticism falls like a sudden splash of cold water. This is not an isolated event. Little by little, gentle suggestions turn into commands, and friendly advice becomes criticism. Mrs. Rosa feels her personal space shrinking, her voice fading. Sound familiar? Perhaps you've been through something similar, or know someone who has. Psychologist Erik Erikson, renowned for his theory on psychosocial development, emphasizes the importance of preserving autonomy in later life. Erikson warns that losing one's independence can lead to an identity crisis and a sense of despair. Isn't it ironic that, by seeking support from loved ones, we might lose something as precious as our own essence? Mrs. Rosa begins to feel the burden of this truth. Her days, once filled with plans and ambitions, now revolve around caring for grandchildren and following orders. Where is the woman who once dreamed of traveling and learning new things? She slowly fades under the weight of others' expectations. A study from the University of Michigan found that older adults who maintain their independence report higher levels of life satisfaction. It makes sense, doesn't it? Imagine how we would feel if someone dictated every aspect of our lives. Frustration begins to take root in Mrs. Rosa's heart. "Each you should do it this way," or "why don't you listen," is a small jab at her self-esteem. Resentment, an unwelcome guest, settles in the home that was once her haven. One evening, after an especially trying day, Mrs. Rosa finds herself silently crying in her room. The walls that once offered her shelter now feel like they're closing in. She feels trapped, unappreciated, like an old piece of furniture that no one values but no one dares to discard. How many of our elders might be living this silent drama? The irony is heartbreaking. In seeking family warmth, Mrs. Rosa has lost the spark of her own identity. The closeness that should bring comfort has become an invisible prison. How can one escape this snare? Is there a way to reclaim independence without surrendering family love? Philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, "The purpose of life is to grow, not only physically but mentally and spiritually." But how can Mrs. Rosa grow when she feels herself diminishing each day within her own home? Get ready to see how an old friend changed the course of Mrs. Rosa's life in an unexpected way. The unexpected revelation. Words of wisdom from a lifelong friend. Advice that challenges everything we think we know about aging and family life. It was an ordinary day when Carmela, Mrs. Rosa's lifelong friend, decided to surprise her with a visit. Wearing her familiar warm smile and holding a bag of freshly baked cookies, Carmela rang the doorbell. But what she saw on the other side of the door took her by surprise. "Rosa, is that you? You seem different," Carmela exclaimed, noticing the dark circles and weary look on her friend's face. Mrs. Rosa, attempting to mask her exhaustion, welcomed her in with a forced smile. As they shared coffee in the kitchen, Carmela couldn't help but observe the unusual clutter in her normally pristine friend's home. "Rosa, is everything okay? You seem a bit off," she asked with genuine concern. And that's when the floodgates opened. Like a dam giving way, Mrs. Rosa began to pour out her emotions. Her weariness, her frustrations, her feeling of being trapped in a life she no longer recognized as her own. "You know, Carmela, sometimes I feel like I've lost my essence. I'm no longer Rosa. I'm just Grandma," she confided, wiping away tears. "I adore my grandchildren, but where is the woman who once dreamed of travel, who read novels late into the night?" Carmela listened intently, nodding in understanding. When Rosa had finished, her friend took her hands in her own and, with a knowing smile, said, "Rosa dear, what if I told you I went through the same thing and found a solution that changed my life?" Mrs. Rosa's eyes widened. "You? But you always seem so happy, so free," she replied, astonished. Carmela chuckled. "Oh, it wasn't always that way. Remember when my kids convinced me to move in with them? Well, after 6 months, I realized I was making the biggest mistake of my life." And so Carmela began to share her story. How, like Rosa, she had lost her independence, her interests, her very self. But one day, she remembered the words of philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. "The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be." "And I decided," Carmela continued, "to be myself again." Mrs. Rosa listened, captivated, as Carmela recounted the brave choice to move in her own apartment. "It wasn't easy," Carmela admitted. "My children didn't understand at first. But over time, our relationship actually improved. They no longer saw me as a burden or just a babysitter, but as their mother, a joyful, independent woman." "But don't you feel lonely sometimes?" Rosa asked. The Awakening, Rediscovering the Value of Self-Reliance. Don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on upcoming videos. If you enjoy this kind of content as much as I do, leave a comment saying, "I love these stories." Also, feel free to suggest what you'd like to see in future videos. I read every single comment. Let's keep learning together and enhancing our lives. Carmela gave Rosa's hand a warm squeeze. "Rosa, my dear, true love is never controlling. Your children will love you even more when they see the joy you find in being true to yourself. Start with small actions. Sign up for that painting class you always wanted to join. Take a morning walk by yourself, and gradually reclaim your personal space." And so, with a cup of cold coffee in hand and a heart brimming with newfound hope, Mrs. Rosa embraced a challenge she never anticipated, reevaluating her life and embracing the value of independence. Carmela's unexpected visit had brought more than just cookies. It planted the seed of a new beginning. Mrs. Rosa found herself at a pivotal moment. On one hand, she adored her family with all her heart. The difficult conversation, breaking the cycle of dependence. With her heart pounding, Mrs. Rosa took a deep breath and settled down in front of her daughter. "Lucia, my dear, we need to talk," she said, her voice quivering slightly. Lucia looked at her, curiosity evident, without a clue of what was about to unfold. "I've been doing a lot of reflecting lately," Mrs. Rosa began, "and I think it's time for me to have a place of my own." The silence that followed was intense. Lucia blinked a few times, as if trying to absorb what she had just heard. "But Mom," Lucia stammered, "aren't you happy here? Did we do something wrong?" Her voice was filled with concern and tinged with a bit of guilt. Mrs. Rosa gave her a gentle smile. "No, my love, you all have been wonderful, but I need to rediscover myself, to have my own space." She thought of the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre's words, "Man is condemned to be free." At 70, she was choosing that freedom for herself. Lucia's expression shifted from surprise to confusion, then softened to a blend of sadness and understanding. "But, Mom, will you be okay on your own? What if something happens?" she asked, her eyes filled with worry. Mrs. Rosa took her daughter's hands. Look, Lucia, I'm not disappearing. I just want a space of my own to grow and savor this chapter of my life. She recalled a University of Michigan study showing that seniors who maintain their independence report greater life satisfaction. But what about the kids? They adore having you here, Lucia argued, holding on to the last reason she could think of. Mrs. Rosa smiled, and I love being with them. But I think I'll be an even better grandmother if I have time to recharge. As writer and Mauro Lindbergh once said, the greatest pleasure in human life is to be loved, but loved freely, with choice. Lucia sat quietly, processing her mother's words. Finally, with teary eyes, she nodded. You're right, Mom. It's just we're gonna miss you so much. And I'll miss you all too, Mrs. Rosa replied, embracing her daughter warmly. But think of all the tasty meals I'll make when you visit, without anyone telling me I'm adding too much salt. They both laughed, breaking the tension. Family psychologist Dr. Maria Elena Rodriguez points out that while these conversations may be tough, they're vital for sustaining healthy bonds between parents and adult children. Open and honest communication, even when it involves major changes, can strengthen family connections. As they talked, Lucia began to see things from her mother's point of view. I suppose we all need a bit of space, she admitted. You've given so many years to caring for us. Mrs. Rosa nodded, grateful for her daughter's empathy. Exactly. And now, it's time for me to care for myself. She recalled the poet Rumi's words. Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself. Lucia's face softened, a mix of pride and nostalgia in her eyes. Well, Mom, I suppose we'll just have to help you find the perfect apartment. One with a big enough kitchen for all your secret recipes. And with a balcony for my plants, Mrs. Rosa added, her face lighting up with excitement.
The rebirth, a new chapter in Mrs. Rosa's life. As she stepped over the threshold of her new apartment, Mrs. Rosa felt a blend of anticipation and nerves. Am I doing the right thing? She wondered. But as the psychologist Carl Jung once said, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. Mrs. Rosa had chosen to be courageous. Decorating her new home became a surprising form of therapy. Each item she placed was an affirmation of her identity. The vibrant rug she had always loved, which her daughter found too bold, and the paintings by her favorite artists, now hanging proudly on the walls. She even dared to paint one wall a vivid turquoise. Oh, if my Ramon could see me now, she chuckled, thinking fondly of her late husband. Mrs. Rosa's true renewal, however, began when she stepped out of her comfort zone. She enrolled in a gardening workshop at the community center. Plants and grandmothers, a classic combination, she thought wryly. That's where she met Mrs. Consuelo, a widow with a sharp sense of humor who quickly became her partner in new experiences. Together, they explored the idea of active aging. It was more than just keeping busy, it was about living with purpose. The World Health Organization states that active aging allows individuals to fulfill their potential for physical, social, and mental well-being across their entire lives. Mrs. Rosa and Mrs. Consuelo decided to try yoga classes. The first session was a hilarious fiasco. I felt like a twisted pretzel, Mrs. Rosa joked, but they kept at it, and soon they began noticing improvements in their flexibility and balance. More importantly, they were laughing as they hadn't in years. One day, over coffee after class, Mrs. Consuelo remarked, "Have you realized we don't complain about our aches and pains anymore?" It was true. They had become so engrossed in living that they'd stopped thinking about aging. The Roman philosopher Seneca once said, "Life is like a play. It's not about how long it lasts, but how well it's performed." Mrs. Rosa was determined to make this second act her finest. She dared to try even more. She joined a book club where she rekindled her passion for poetry and even began writing her own verses, something she hadn't done since her youth. "The lines on the paper are softer than the ones on my face," she joked with her new friends. The most profound change, however, was in her relationship with her family. Ironically, by having her own space, visits from her children and grandchildren became more precious. They were no longer a duty, but a shared joy. One Sunday, as her eldest granddaughter helped her water plants on the balcony, Mrs. Rosa had a revelation. Not only had she reclaimed her independence, but she was also imparting an invaluable lesson to younger generations about aging with dignity and delight. The paradox of love teaches us that sometimes a bit of distance is the secret ingredient to deepening closeness.
The paradox of love, how distance strengthens bonds. When Mrs. Rosa decided to move in her own apartment, many thought she was making a poor choice. "How will you manage alone at your age?" they questioned. With a playful smile, she replied, "Alone? I have a more active social life than an influencer." And she wasn't exaggerating. The physical separation between Mrs. Rosa and her family turned out to be like an elastic band. Stretching it a bit only increased the strength of their connection. Visits from her grandchildren became eagerly anticipated adventures. They were no longer routine afternoons spent in front of the TV, but exciting expeditions filled with laughter and discovery. One day, her grandchildren arrived to find her in the middle of painting a giant canvas. "Grandma, you look like Picasso," exclaimed young Mateo. With paint even on her eyebrows, she replied, "Picasso? He's too small for me. I'm the great Rosa." That afternoon, amidst brushstrokes and laughter, they created a family masterpiece that now hangs proudly in her living room. But it wasn't only the visits that grew richer. Phone calls, once brief and obligatory, became longer and more meaningful. As psychologist Carl Rogers once said, "A good communicator listens not only with their ears, but with their eyes and heart." And this was exactly what was happening within Mrs. Rosa's family. Mrs. Rosa's independence sparked change throughout the family. Her daughter, Lucia, admitted, "Seeing Mom so content and self-sufficient inspired me to pursue my own dreams. Freedom, it seems, is contagious." And Mrs. Rosa's example was planting seeds of transformation among her loved ones. A University of Michigan study has shown that older adults who maintain their autonomy report higher life satisfaction and improved family connections. Mrs. Rosa's story was living proof of this, challenging assumptions about aging. Over coffee one afternoon, Mrs. Rosa reflected with her friends, "You know, I used to think love meant always being together. Now I see that real love gives each other space to grow." Her words echoed the wisdom of poet Khalil Gibran, who advised to leave space in your togetherness. Mrs. Rosa had uncovered the paradox of love, that sometimes a little distance is needed to bring us closer. As philosopher Eric Fromm once said, mature love says, "I need you because I love you," not, "I love you because I need you." Mrs. Rosa had transitioned from a stifling dependency to a healthy, interdependent love. This new family dynamic benefited not only Mrs. Rosa, but everyone around her. Her grandchildren now enjoyed two nurturing homes. Her children felt less pressured and more appreciative, and Mrs. Rosa was thriving in her newfound life. It was as if they discovered the secret to a happy family. And, ironically, the main ingredient was a little distance. Mrs. Rosa realized that the key was neither living with her children nor being completely apart, but finding a harmonious balance. The wisdom of balance, finding the middle ground. Mrs. Rosa found herself in an unexpected space, neither fully isolated nor overly enmeshed with her family. As the Greek philosopher Aristotle would say, virtue lies in the middle, and Mrs. Rosa experienced this firsthand. After her epiphany and bold decision to reclaim her independence, she encountered a new dilemma: how to maintain a close connection with her family without giving up her newfound freedom. The answer, as with many of life's profound truths, was straightforward yet challenging: balance. Mrs. Rosa discovered that the key was healthy interdependence, a concept American psychologist Stephen Covey describes as the blend of independence and dependence. For Mrs. Rosa, this meant setting firm yet adaptable boundaries. For example, she agreed to babysit her grandchildren 2 afternoons a week, reserving the rest of her time for her own pursuits. "It's like juggling," she would joke, "but instead of balls, I'm balancing love, freedom, and responsibility." This new approach had an unexpected effect on the quality of time she spent with her family. Instead of endless, routine hours, they now shared special moments filled with laughter and genuine connection. As writer Mitch Albom once said, "Death ends a life, not a relationship." Mrs. Rosa realized that deepening her relationships wasn't about the amount of time spent, but the quality of it. Yet, the journey wasn't without challenges. There were days when guilt would sneak back, like a shadow on a bright day. In those moments, Mrs. Rosa would recall the words of psychologist Carl Jung: "What you deny subjugates you. What you accept transforms you." Rather than denying her feelings, she embraced them, using them as a chance to reaffirm her choices. A study by the University of Michigan found that older adults who balance independence with family support are 30% less likely to experience depression. Mrs. Rosa embodied this statistic, as her newfound balance brought her not only joy, but better health. Over time, she became something of a guide to her friends in the senior support group. She shared her experiences with humor and insight, saying, "My dears, old age is like fine wine. It needs room to breathe, but also the warmth of good company to develop its full flavor." Her story inspired many to reconsider their family dynamics. As anthropologist Margaret Mead famously said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." In her small circle, Mrs. Rosa was indeed making a difference, one family at a time. But perhaps the most profound change was in Mrs. Rosa herself. She no longer saw herself as a burden or a passive figure in her family's life. She was now a woman with purpose, with dreams, and the energy to pursue them. As philosopher Seneca once said, "It's not that we have little time, but that we waste a great deal of it." And Mrs. Rosa was resolute not to let another moment slip by. Mrs. Rosa's journey shows us how an act of self-love can transform not only the individual, but also the lives of those around her. Mrs. Rosa's legacy, a lesson in self-love and family. When Mrs. Rosa chose to reclaim her independence, she wasn't just doing herself a favor. She was planting seeds of wisdom within her family. Psychologist Carl Jung once remarked that the greatest impact we can have on our children isn't through direct teaching, but by living our own lives fully. And Mrs. Rosa embodied this sentiment. Her courage had a ripple effect. Her daughter, initially hesitant, began to see her not just as grandma, but as a woman with dreams and passions of her own, inspiring her to reevaluate her own path. For her grandchildren, Mrs. Rosa became a source of exciting stories, sparking a newfound curiosity about independence and lifelong growth. Her legacy extends beyond her immediate family, urging us all to reflect on our relationships. Are we giving our loved ones the space they need, or are we unknowingly restricting them with expectations? Philosopher Khalil Gibran wrote, "Your children are not your children. They are sons and daughters of life's longing for itself." Mrs. Rosa knew this applies to parents too. We are not our children's property. We are individuals with the right to live our own lives. So, dear viewer, ask yourself, are you truly living for yourself or for others' expectations? It's never too late to start anew. Whether it's that adventure you've dreamed of or stepping out of your comfort zone, go for it. Goethe said, Whatever you can do, or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Remember, the best gift you can give your family is your own happiness. If you've made it to this point, comment "Water is powerful," so I know who stayed till the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more content like this. Share this video with loved ones so they can embrace this wisdom today. And consider supporting the channel by becoming a member for exclusive perks and to help us continue bringing you valuable insights.